Most people think that reaching $20,000 is a big milestone, like it means they finally made it, and everything's going to get easier from that point forward. But in reality, it's the complete opposite. $20,000 is not comfort, it's pressure. It's the point where things stop feeling simple, and every decision suddenly starts to matter a lot more than before, because this is where the real game begins. At the beginning, when you're making small amounts, everything feels safe. Mistakes are normal, and losses don't really change your life in a major way. But at $20,000, something changes inside your mind. You stop thinking casually and start thinking emotionally. Every decision feels heavier, and every loss starts to feel personal instead of just part of the process. This is a level where confidence starts to shift into pressure. You begin to believe you should already know what you're doing, even if you don't fully understand everything yet. And that's dangerous, because instead of learning calmly, you start forcing results. Because what got you to $20,000 was mostly experimentation, small wins, and learning from mistakes. But now those same mistakes cost more. And when mistakes become expensive, your behavior changes, not always in a good way. This is where most people stop growing without realizing it, not because they lack opportunity, but because they become afraid to lose what they already built. And fear is one of the biggest barriers to scaling. At this stage, people make a critical mistake. They think the solution is to work harder, trade more, or take more actions. But in reality, more effort without clarity only creates more confusion. Because $20,000 doesn't require more action. It requires better thinking. You don't need to do more things. You need to stop doing the wrong things repeatedly. This is where professionals separate from beginners. Beginners chase every opportunity they see, hoping something will work. But professionals wait patiently for the right moment and then act with precision. And here's the truth most people don't realize. The biggest challenge at $20,000 is no longer the market. It's your own emotions. Fear starts showing up more often. Ego becomes louder. And impatience pushes you to make decisions you normally wouldn't make. At this point, you're not just learning how to make money anymore. You're learning how to protect what you already have. And that shift changes everything. Because survival at this level depends on discipline, not excitement, not randomness, just controlled, consistent decisions. The boring truth is, consistency builds more wealth than emotional decisions ever will. But most people quit here because it doesn't feel exciting anymore. They start chasing excitement again. And in doing so, they destroy the progress they already made. Because emotional decisions always restart the cycle. But if you stay disciplined through this phase, you don't just maintain $20,000. You break past it. Because $20,000 is not your limit. It's your test. And how you behave here determines everything that comes next. Most people fail this stage without even realizing it. Not because they were unlucky, but because they didn't adapt their mindset. But the ones who adjust, who slow down, who think differently, they move forward. And eventually, they realize something powerful. Money is not about speed. It's about control. Once you understand that, everything becomes easier to manage. Not easier to get rich fast, but easier to grow consistently. So if you're sitting at $20,000 right now, don't get comfortable. Get aware, because this is where everything changes again. So if you're sitting at $20,000 right now, don't get comfortable. Get aware, because this is where everything changes again. Because $20,000 is not the destination. It's the first real checkpoint where life starts testing whether you deserve more or whether you will lose what you already built. Most people don't even notice when the shift happens. They think they're still in growth mode, but in reality, they've entered a phase where every decision carries weight. At this level, things stop feeling easy and start feeling serious. One good move can boost your confidence, but one wrong move can take away days or even weeks of progress. And that emotional pressure is what silently breaks most people. Not the market, not the opportunities, but the way they react when money starts to actually matter. Because now every decision feels personal. You stop experimenting freely like before, and instead you start hesitating. You start thinking twice, overthinking simple choices, And suddenly opportunities that once felt normal now feel risky. But the opportunities didn't change, you changed. Your mindset shifted from expansion to protection. And protection sounds safe, but too much of it kills growth, because growth cannot happen in fear. At this stage, people divide into two groups. The first group freezes. They start playing so safe that they stop growing completely. They repeat the same cycle over and over again, gaining a little, losing a little, but never really moving forward. The second group adapts. They realize that more action is not the answer anymore. Better thinking is. They stop chasing everything and start focusing on systems instead of emotions, because randomness destroys consistency, and consistency is the only thing that actually scales beyond this level. But here's the hidden problem most people never see coming. Your emotions become louder than your strategy. Fear starts speaking more than logic. Impatience starts pushing decisions. Ego starts whispering that you should be doing more even when you shouldn't. And that's exactly where mistakes are born. Not from lack of knowledge, but from emotional decisions under pressure. So the real challenge at $20,000 is not learning new strategies. It's mastering the ones you already have without letting emotions interfere. Because calm execution always beats chaotic effort. Stability in your mind creates stability in your results. And slowly, you start to understand something deeper. At this level, money is no longer about effort. It's about behavior. If your behavior is unstable, your results will always be unstable. But if your behavior becomes disciplined, your results slowly begin to stabilize and grow in a controlled way. That's why some people stay stuck for years, while others quietly move ahead. The difference is not talent, and it's not luck. It's control. Control over impulses. Control over emotions. Control over decisions when pressure increases. Because at $20,000, you're no longer being tested on how much you can make. You're being tested on how well you can manage what you already have. And if you survive this phase, if you stay disciplined when it gets uncomfortable, you don't just grow, you evolve. Because $20,000 was never the goal. It was a filter. And if you survive this phase, if you stay disciplined when it gets uncomfortable, you don't just grow, you evolve. Because $20,000 was never the goal. It was a filter. And here's what most people don't realize. Once you pass this filter, nothing feels the same again. You don't go back to thinking like before. You start noticing patterns you ignored earlier. You become more aware of your own decisions, your habits, and even your emotional reactions. It's like something inside you slows down, and suddenly you can see things more clearly. But clarity comes with responsibility, because now you know better, which means you can no longer blame confusion. And that's where things get harder in a different way. Not externally, but internally. Because when you understand more, you also expect more from yourself. And that expectation creates pressure. This is why many people actually prefer staying below this level without realizing it. Because below $20,000, mistakes feel normal. But above it, mistakes feel like failures. And that shift in perception changes everything. It changes how you act, how you think, and how long you can stay consistent. At this stage, success is no longer about motivation. Motivation becomes irrelevant. Some days you'll feel motivated. Most days you won't. And if your system depends on motivation, it will collapse. That's why the only thing that works here is structure, repetition, discipline, doing the same right things even when nothing feels exciting. And that's the part almost everyone underestimates. They think success is about finding something new, a new strategy, a new opportunity, a new method. But at this level, new is not what you need. Stability is what you need, because instability is what keeps resetting your progress. Now, something interesting starts to happen when you stay consistent long enough. You stop reacting emotionally to wins and losses. A win doesn't make you overconfident anymore, and a loss doesn't destroy your mindset. You start treating both as information instead of identity. And that emotional distance is what allows you to scale without breaking. Because emotional attachment is expensive. Every emotional decision costs you clarity. And every lack of clarity costs you money. So the more emotionally neutral you become, the more precise your decisions get. And precision is what separates people who stay stuck at $20K from people who quietly move to $50,000, $100,000, and beyond. But there's another layer most people don't see coming. Once you stabilize at $20,000, the game doesn't get easier, it gets quieter. The chaos reduces. The excitement reduces. The big emotional highs and lows start disappearing. And that silence makes people uncomfortable because they confuse silence with stagnation. They think nothing is happening, when in reality everything important is happening internally. Your discipline is being tested. Your patience is being tested. Your ability to repeat the same process without emotional reward is being tested. And this is where most people quit. Not because they are failing, but because they are bored. But boredom is actually a sign of maturity. It means you are no longer dependent on emotional stimulation to function. And that is a powerful stage to be in, even though it doesn't feel powerful at all. If you push through this phase, something very important changes in your identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone trying to make money and start seeing yourself as someone who manages outcomes. That shift sounds small, but it changes everything. Because when you manage outcomes, you stop chasing randomness and start building control. And control creates consistency. Now consistency is where real scaling begins. Not excitement, not hype, not sudden wins, but calm, repetitive execution that compounds slowly over time. And compounding always feels slow at the beginning. That's why most people underestimate it and abandon it too early. But if you stay long enough, compounding becomes visible, not in one big moment, but in small shifts, slight improvements in decision-making, slight improvements in timing, slight improvements in patience. And those small improvements stack until your entire financial reality shifts. At this point, something very subtle happens again. You stop fearing $20,000. Then you stop being impressed by $20,000. And eventually, $20,000 becomes just a number, not because it lost value, but because your identity expanded beyond it. And this is the real transformation. Money doesn't change people. Identity does. Money only exposes what you already are. And $20,000 is the level where your identity gets exposed very clearly. It shows whether you are reactive or controlled, impulsive or disciplined, emotional or structured. And once you see that clearly, you cannot unsee it. So the question is not, how do I make more than $20,000? The real question is, who do I need to become to handle more than $20,000 without losing control? Because if you don't upgrade the person, the money will never stay. It will come and go in cycles. But when the person upgrades, the money stabilizes. And that's the difference most people miss completely. They focus on numbers, but ignore identity. They focus on results, but ignore behavior. And that's why they keep repeating the same level over and over again. But if you break that cycle, if you stay consistent long enough, if you master your reactions, then $20,000 stops being a challenge. It becomes your foundation. And from there, everything else becomes a scaling process, not a survival process.